Hey there everyone, it's Jaycee for a perfect crafty pairing. I made greeting cards with the same stamp set in 3 different art styles. Do you agree with the mood I'm trying to create with these projects? Keep watching to find out what they are. April 2021 Flower of the Month challenge is still active, and sharing your project on Instagram enters you in for a chance to win a gift card to the Altenew online shop. This month's flower is the April birth flower, Daisy, and the Build-A-Flower for April 2021 happens to be part of the Asteraceae family, Coneflower. I'll focus on the stamp set for today's projects. For my first artistic style, I'll pair the Build-A-Flower Coneflower with a similarly looking flower, Perfectly Perfect stamp set. The Perfectly Perfect stamp set doesn't have layering stamps, so it's awesome for coloring. My coloring medium I'll use for this card is watercolor, so I'll need watercolor paper. I love the A2 loose sheets because the paper die cuts really well and it is smooth in texture. I'll also use the silicone stamping mat as my palette for coloring. First things first, I'll stamp the outline images of both Build-A-Flower Coneflower and Perfectly Perfect onto the watercolor paper. I'm using a water-soluble ink in a beige color. As I'm getting set up for watercoloring, I grabbed these watercolor brush marker refills or liquid watercolors. I ended up only using the Emerald, Espresso, and Jet Black liquid watercolors. Lagoon will come into play later. Then my brush of choice is the number 1 round brush from the round watercolor brush set. So those are my materials for watercoloring. Now, creative coloring is not my feature, that's Aram's specialty. I'm using the liquid watercolors to no outline color these flowers and foliage. The colors I'm using are Espresso on the petals and Emerald on the leaves, using a wet on wet technique to get beautifully blended layers. I'll speed this portion up and I'll see you at the end of the coloring process. Total coloring time for this piece was about 40 minutes. Earlier I mentioned using the Lagoon watercolor brush marker refill, but instead I decided to use the brush marker itself. What I'm going to do is outline and overcompensate the outer portion of the images. I like the synthetic bristles on the brush marker for this reason, because it comes to a really fine point, and I can get between the flower petals without losing definition. I'll skip forward to show you what I mean. I'm eliminating the white space around the images so that when I die cut them, the flowers will look truly creamy white on a dark background. And I overcompensated by about 1/4 of an inch just in case. For now, I'll set this aside to fully dry and work on the background to this card. I want an edge-to-edge watercolor background without a white margin. If I were to tape down the A2 watercolor cardstock, I would get a margin of white space where I masked off the paper. So I'm going to transition to the 9 by 12 inch watercolor paper and cut it into quarters for a final size of 4.5 by 6 inches. I taped a very thin margin around the paper to my silicone stamping mat, and I'll use the Lagoon liquid watercolor to make a very textured ombre with the highest color saturation at the bottom. I'll layer the Lagoon liquid watercolor with the flat watercolor brush included in the round brush set. I'm making sure to dry the watercolor panel between layers so that I get a true intensity of color in the final result. Finally, I'll add Lagoon splatters to finish off this watercolor background and set this aside to fully dry flat. Once dry, I'll use my jet black dye ink pad and my small ink blending tool to add a vignette around the background. Back over to my watercolor flowers, I'll use the coordinating dies to cut out the images. I glued down the watercolor background to my note card base, and then adhered my arranged flowers to my background. I finished this card with some gold pearl splatters from the 14 metallic watercolor pan set. I masked my sentiment area with my hand as I did this. Then finally, I glued down antique gold sequins. This first artistic iteration was inspired by the style of Tim Holtz, vintage, antique, distressed. What other words do you think would describe this card style? Let's move forward with this next card. Again, I'm trying out a different style for this second project. Here is the Build-A-Flower Coneflower. And this time I'm accompanying the Build-A-Flower with Sunflower Daisy stamp and die set. Again, I chose this set for the April 2021 Flower of the Month challenge. I want a no outline look again, but this time I wanted the coneflower images to match the sunflower daisy images. You'll notice there is no outline to the sunflower daisy stamp set, which gives these beautiful and almost digital print look to the images. I will use the outline to get started on Build-A-Flower Coneflower, but I'll stamp it in a light gray ink. I'm using Limestone Crisp Dye Ink to stamp the outline of the largest flower in Build-A-Flower Coneflower. Then I'm aligning the stamp layers according to the package instructions. To get clean impressions, I'm rubbing the Altenew Stamp Conditioning Eraser to dull the surface of the stamp. I'll go through the colors and layers quickly here. So I'm starting with D1 in Sunkissed, and I'll stamp that in full saturation. Then I'll diffuse and ink blend on the stamp on the D2 layer with orange cream. Then finally I'll use Fire Brick on the D3 layer. These colors are from the Warm and Cozy Mini Cube set. Moving on, I'll use almond butter on the E1 layer, then milk chocolate on the E2 layer. Those colors come from the Delectable Delights mini cube set. Finally, to finish this flower, I'll use Dusk on the F1 layer. Then I was supposed to grab Desert Night on the F2 layer, but I grabbed Dusk again. I'll fix that later. Those colors are from the Cool Summer Nights family of inks. Okay, next flower, I'm going to neglect the capital A1 layer of Sunflower Daisy and start with the A2 layer. I'm stamping that in vanilla cream. The A3 layer in hazelnut. Then finally the A4 layer in almond butter. For the center of the flower, I'll use the same almond butter color on the lowercase A1 layer. Milk chocolate on the A2 layer. Then finally jet black on the A3 layer. For the smaller leaf clusters, I stamped the solid images in Desert Night. Then I layered the capital C1 leaves using ocean waves. C2 in dusk. Then C3 in Desert Night. I felt the E1 layer in the Build-A-Flower Coneflower needed a little bit more definition, so I added a shadow of jet black just on the bottom of the image. After layering and stamping all the images, I die cut them using the coordinating dies. Then I made a draft arrangement on my craft mat. I love this tiny bouquet and the color impact of the composition. To start the assembly of this card, I used the Fine Frames rectangle die to obtain this thin black frame. I adhered this directly to a white cardstock panel as close to the center as I could. I went ahead and added my sentiment to this card. I used part of a sentiment in the Sunflower Daisy stamp set. I used washi tape to mask off the sentiment that I didn't want. Inked up the sentiment I wanted. Removed the washi tape. Then stamped the sentiment. I really like the minimal freshness and light sentiment. Then using my favorite Glad pressing seal, I adhered my entire bouquet at one time to the center of my note card front. The style of this card might not be so obvious, but to oppose the previous jewel-toned card, I brought this one to more modern times. I thought the simplicity of this arrangement had a more graphic art feel, something that could look printed or mass-produced, but it is truly one of a kind and handmade. For my final project, I'm going with a style that isn't covered too often, but a type of card that I'm often asked to make, cryptic, right? The stamp set I'm pairing for this project with Build-A-Flower Coneflower is Retro Plantines, something a little different. In principle, this one is going to be easy to work up, but the inspiration for this card is quite unique, which lends itself to the style I was looking for. I'm going to stamp all the images on my favorite spicy yogurt cardstock. I finally replenished my stash recently. I'll stamp the outline images and a few of the detail layers from Coneflower in mahogany bark. Then I'll stamp a few of the images from Retro Plantines stamp set. I'll do what I've been doing these last two cards and die cut all the images. I already have a rough arrangement planned here. But in true crafty fashion, things are bound to change. I picked everything up with Glad Press and Seal and opted for this orientation of the arrangement instead. I glued the entire arrangement at the same time to my background cardstock. It's another panel of spicy yogurt cardstock. Then finally, I finished this card with a partial sentiment like the previous card. I masked off the hello portion of the sentiment in retro Plantines and left it as awesomeness. This card style was inspired by the color palette of Mendi or henna, but the single tone minimal cluster of flowers is meant to represent a fabric print that I might find on a men's shirt. Yet florals can be for guys too. It's just a matter of figuring out how to compose your art. I thought the mix of visual textures such as the spotty details and bold lines were more cognizant of tropical dress shirts. And then instead of a pretty and soft bouquet, I thought this more cradled and semicircular look to the flowers was more visually interesting. So what do you think? Do you all agree with the three visual styles I was trying to evoke with Build a Flower Coneflower? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to participate in the hashtag ALTENEWFLOWEROFTHEMONTH challenge on Instagram. I have the source video with everything you need to know linked in the description box. I'm so glad to see you back for my first perfect pairing in April. I have videos coming up every second and fourth Sunday, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on my series. Thank you so much for watching this perfect pairings with me, and I'll see you in the next one.
Hello there, crafty friend, Lydia here. Just popping in to say that you can get your daily dose of crafting tips, techniques, and tutorials just like this by subscribing to the Altenew YouTube channel. All you need to do is click on that little bell up there and you will never miss a video. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.